session you just heard with Aaron David Miller and Tammy Wittes. I'm Susie Gelman. I chair the board of the Israel Policy Forum, and it's my pleasure to be the introducer and moderator of today's session. I want to thank the organizers of the JCPA conference for the opportunity to present information and pragmatic proposals regarding the two-state solution. So IPF, Israel Policy Forum, has been in existence since 1993. The organization was created at the behest of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, who came to the United States searching for an American Jewish organizational partner to support his efforts to advance peace through the Oslo Accords. Finding none, one had to be created, hence we are here. And we have been in this space ever since, advancing and promoting the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm here today to tell you that the two-state solution is not dead. Challenged, very much so. On life support, perhaps. But it cannot be dead for the simple reason that there is no other solution that will preserve Israel's future as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state. And since in the Torah, things that are really important are said twice, I'm going to say it again. There is no other solution that will preserve Israel's future as a Jewish, democratic, and secure state. So it is incumbent upon all of us to do what we can to keep it alive. IPF is pleased to partner with two organizations that focus respectively on the short-term and long-term options for two states. Our partners in Israel, our partner in Israel, is an organization called the Commanders for Israel's Security. Over 265 retired generals from all of the security services, the IDF, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, the police forces, who have come together to make their case to the Israeli public and to the Israeli government about steps Israel can take right now without an identified partner to improve Israel's security, strengthen the Palestinian economy, and better Israel's standing in the international community. Their plan, called Security First, also preserves the possibility of returning to the negotiating table when conditions permit. And recently, about a month ago, they rolled out a public awareness campaign in Israel, separation, not annexation. This is a major PR campaign that got a lot of buzz in Israel, and there's a lot of, they really changed the conversation. Now the word separation has entered the Israeli lexicon in a way it did not exist before. And the idea in part is to preserve the facts on the ground so that eventually a state of Palestine is physically and politically possible. And you're going to hear more about that in a minute. IPF also partners with the Center for New American Security, CNAS, a bipartisan Washington think tank that has done extensive work to develop a proposal that could serve as a framework for the next round of negotiations when they eventually take place. The CNAS plan draws on the work done by General John Allen when he was deployed to the region by then Secretary John Kerry to create a plan that would address Israel's security concerns and provide a detailed series of steps for gradual redeployment out of the West Bank as part of a permanent status agreement. The year 2017 is a significant year in Israel's history, marked by three very important milestones. In November, we will mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which first gave formal recognition to Jewish aspirations for a homeland of our own. Also in November, we will mark 70 years since the UN vote to approve partition into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, thereby ending the British mandate and paving the way for Israel's independence. And finally, of course, in May of this year, according to the Hebrew calendar, we will mark 50 years since the Six-Day War, an amazing military victory which gave Israel a vast territorial advantage, but also resulted in what is now 50 years of occupation in the West Bank. This anniversary year requires us to reflect on and work for Israel's future, which is why I'm delighted to present our panelists to discuss that future. To my immediate right is David Halperin, the Executive Director of Israel Policy Forum. Next to him is Michael Koplow, who is IPF's Policy Director. And finally, we have Ilan Goldenberg, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at CNAS and also an IPF advisor. After David, Michael, and Ilan each make some remarks, of course, we're going to open up to Q&A. Without further ado, I'm going to give it to David.
Thank you very much, Susie, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many friendly, familiar faces. Susie, and I want to thank David, who I saw earlier, David Bernstein and Cheryl Fishbein. I see Jeremy from Chicago. I saw Rory from St. Louis. He's Tamara, who's literally my neighbor, is right behind me. So it's great to be here. Just to reiterate a couple of things that Susie mentioned. When we approach this work, and frankly, I think when our community approaches this issue, we at IPF think there are three sort of fundamentals that should guide us. The first is a commitment to security. I don't think anybody can speak seriously in their community, to leaders in the community or policymakers, without putting security at the forefront of our understanding of what needs to be assured and advancing any sort of process. That's why over the last year, as Susie mentioned, we've worked very closely with this wide network of generals, the Commanders for Israel Security in Israel, on near-term steps, as well as the Center for New American Security on the long term, which you're going to hear about a bit shortly. All of that you'll find on our website, twostatesecurity.org, and we are committed to bringing programs for engagement and dialogue around the country on that subject. So the first is security. It's the first key principle. The second is we need Israeli partners. It's not enough for the American Jewish community to really want to see this happen if there are not Israeli partners who we are working with, who we are supporting, and we are turning to give us guidance for what can be moved forward in Israel and to promote these ideas in Israel. Our best efforts will remain limited. And lastly, we should focus on the pragmatic. What is achievable? I think we all recognize what the end game is. But what can be done tomorrow to begin to turn things toward a more, to trend closer toward the goal that we achieve, not away, which has been too often the case as of late. On your chairs when you walked in, you received this booklet, Advancing Two-State Security, which is just about a week old. It incorporates many of the ideas developed by our Israeli partners that we are jointly promoting both in the United States and Israel. To my right, Michael Koplow, our policy director, will speak a bit about some of these near-term policy proposals, and then I'll turn it over to Ilan to give us a sense of the longer-term picture on how two states could be consistent with Israel's security, as well as a sense of the broader dynamics at play in the region. Again, we believe that this material is material that can be a source, a tool for engagement and discussion, because it is focused on an area that has been, we all recognize, very politically difficult and toxic to talk about in our communities. I think the one thing that, regardless of where you're at on the political spectrum in the community, I think we all recognize the key importance of Israel's security, both near-term and long-term. And I think as long as we're coming at it from that perspective, we can have a healthy, informed, and reasonable conversation about the way forward. So Michael will talk a bit about near-term arrangements, Ilan the long-term, and then we welcome the conversation.
All right, thank you, David. So before I talk about some of the specifics in the Security First plan, and in some ways I have the easiest task here because you guys have this right here. So Ilan's gonna have to do this without the benefit of a visual aid. Before I talk about some of the details, I think it's important to make a few points about why it's so critical for a plan like this to be adopted now. The first is that, as General Amnon Reshef, who's the founder of Commanders for Israel Security, likes to say, there is no status quo. We can delude ourselves into thinking that the situation on the ground is static, but it certainly is not. All we have to do is look at the last few months in Israel, where you see continuing terrorism. We've had the regulation law, which is really going to, assuming that it on the small assumption the High Court does not strike it down, if it actually goes through, it's really going to upend the status quo in the West Bank in a fundamental way. We've had announcements of new settlements, not just within existing borders, but the Prime Minister's announcement that there's going to be a new settlement to replace Amona. And you have attitudes on both sides in some ways hardening against what has been a consensus on two states. It's still difficult to find a poll that won't show either a clear majority or at the least a clear plurality of people on both sides who support the two-state solution. But it's, the numbers are they're not trending up. And so there is no status quo, and it's important to really address this issue now, despite the fact that a permanent status agreement I don't think is on the horizon. And certainly Ilan can talk about this more given his direct involvement in these efforts on behalf of the U.S. government. But a negotiated solution is simply not in the cards anytime soon, for a whole variety of reasons. The leaders on both sides and President Trump has indicated a willingness to step in, but it's obviously a complicated situation. I think more complicated than he realizes. So, on the assumption that that is not happening anytime soon, and the status quo does not exist. And there's one third assumption I think is important to take into account, which is that Israelis vote on security. The last three elections, before the elections, the polls have all shown that Israelis put socioeconomic issues #1 on their list. They all say they're going to vote for the parties that address the socioeconomic issues in the ways that make the most sense to them. Then they get into the voting booth and they vote on security, and they come out of the voting booth and they tell all the exit pollsters, well, socioeconomic things are important, but once I got in there, I really just had to vote for the person or party who was going to protect my family and me the best. That's understandable. I think that I don't think anybody should in any way judge Israelis for doing that. I would almost certainly do the same thing. But I think the takeaway from that is that Israelis' security concerns are very real and they have to be addressed. And the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians is never going to be resolved in any fundamental way until Israelis are sure that their security needs are going to be protected. And so with that, the Commanders for Israel Security have come up with this plan they call Security First. And what Security First does is it has three baskets: a basket of security measures, a basket of political measures, and a basket of civil and economic measures, all of which are designed to enhance personal and national security for Israelis immediately, and also to preserve conditions for a future permanent status agreement. Now, I think one of the unique features of this program is that we can talk about security measures and political measures and economic measures, but nearly everything that is in this plan does all three simultaneously. And I'll talk about three examples that we have in the briefing book. And as David said, you can go on our website, you can read the plans extensively. I think that the Security First plan runs 58 or 68 pages in very small print. So you can read this for yourselves. There are lots of interactive things and maps, and I'd urge you to check out the source material firsthand. But there are three measures that I want to talk about that are in this book, and all three of them accomplish all three of these goals: security, political, and economic. The first is completing the construction of the security barrier in the West Bank. So everybody famously knows there's a security barrier that Ariel Sharon began to build during the Second Intifada, and it was a great security success. It massively reduced the number of terrorist attacks and suicide bombings taking place within Israel. The problem is that the security barrier was not completed. There are 4 gaps in the security barrier, totaling I think it's about 39 or 40 kilometers, and they're big gaps, and they're being used by Palestinians who come into Israel illegally. There are 100,000 Palestinians who come into Israel every single day. 50,000 of them have permits from the Israeli government. 50,000 of them cross over into Israel through these gaps. They walk through it, and as a security problem, this really can't be overstated. In the last 10 years, there's only been one attack committed by a Palestinian in Israel who was there legally with a work permit. Every other attack of a Palestinian in the West Bank in Israel in the last 10 years has come from somebody who was in Israel illegally, who just walked through one of these giant gaps in the fence. So completing the fence is unquestionably a security measure that has to be taken now. Now the reason the fence has not been completed is for political reasons. The two big gaps in the fence, one is to the east of Ma'ale Adumim, and one is east of Gush Etzion. And the political reason that the barrier has not been completed in those two places is because once the barrier is completed, it makes it more difficult for their settlements to expand east. And in both cases, if the settlements there expand east, and I should note, those settlements are both two of the big block areas. There's no question that Ma'ale Adumim will be kept in a permanent status agreement. There's no question Gush Etzion will be kept in a permanent status agreement. The problem is that if the borders of those keep on migrating farther to the east, it really makes a contiguous Palestinian state very difficult to achieve. And so completing the barrier is not only a security measure, it's a political measure, because in completing the barrier and concurrently for Israel to say that there's going to be no building east of the completed barrier, and that Israel will renounce any future sovereign claims to territory east of the barrier. It's a political measure that is designed to create a two-state situation on the ground in the absence of a negotiated agreement. It starts to create the separation that is really necessary to get to two states. And on the economic measures, as I noted, you have 50,000 Palestinians who are coming in every day without work permits illegally. The fact that there are 100,000 Palestinians coming into Israel every day to work, half with permits, half with not, I think demonstrates that the Israeli economy not only can support it, but probably needs those workers. And so if you're completing the fence, one of the things that goes along with that is doubling the amount of work permits that you grant to the Palestinians. And so you end up in a situation where you have the same number of Palestinian workers who are coming in every day, but they're all legal, and you can track them, and you know who they are, and if there are a few bad apples who sneak through who you have to track down, you can far more easily track them down because you know that they're there. And so this is a measure that at first glance sounds like it's all about security, but it really is about all three of these things. The second is the issue of rezoning in the West Bank. So everybody here will likely be familiar with the three areas of the West Bank: Area A, Area B, and Area C. They were set after Oslo, and they really haven't been shifted in a quarter of a century. And what worked in 1993 doesn't necessarily work anymore today. The same way that we talk about natural growth in Israeli settlements, there's been natural growth in Palestinian villages as well. And why is this a problem? It's a problem because Palestinian villages that were in Area B means that it's under Palestinian administrative control but Israeli security control. Over a quarter century, the ones that were close to the border of Area C have grown, and they've started to bleed over into Area C. And when Palestinian homes are in Area C, they are there illegally. The Israeli government does not grant permits to Palestinians to build in Area C. In 2014, the Israeli government granted 0 permits. In 2015, they granted 1 permit. In 2016, they granted 0 permits. And so there are now 11,000 Palestinian structures that are in Area C as a result of natural growth. They house 200,000 Palestinians, and they are all under demolition order. There's no question this is a security problem. I think that if you demolish 11,000 structures housing 200,000 Palestinians, and you expect those 200,000 Palestinians to be well-behaved residents of the West Bank, you're more optimistic than I am. And so it's certainly a security problem. It's obviously a civil and economic problem if you're going to leave 200,000 Palestinians who are now living in homes that they built homeless. And of course, without question, it creates a political problem as well. And so one of the plans that the Commanders for Israel Security has developed in the Security First plan is you can rezone 4.5% of Area C and make it Area B with literally the defense minister just signing a document. It doesn't require legislation. It doesn't require anything big. It's really just a military signature. You rezone 4.5% of the West Bank. This 4.5% of the West Bank that you'd be rezoning from Area C to Area B contains no Israeli settlements, no Israeli settlers, no IDF installations. It does contain these 11,000 structures. And so literally overnight you can legalize the status of these homes. You can get rid of a huge security problem. You can save the Israeli government from having to go through these demolitions. And again, without moving one Israeli, without moving anything, just by signing a piece of paper. There's no question that as I said, there's no question this is a security issue and a political and economic issue as well. Another rezoning plan for the West Bank also involves Area C and Area B, and again, it doesn't require anything but a military signature. Area B is divided into about 170 different islands, and the reason that they're not contiguous is because all the roads in the West Bank are part of Area C. So Area C is both settlements and also roads, and so these roads divide up Area B into 170 different groups. It's a huge security problem because Palestinian security forces who want to go from one part of Area B to another part of Area B actually have to get permission from the Israeli military because they need a permit to cross into Area C. And they're not actually going to Area C, they're just crossing, going from Area B, crossing to another Area B by using an Area C road, but they can't do it without a permit. And if you are the Israeli government and you say to the PA security forces, hey, we have some intelligence on terrorist activity in one part of Area B, and the PA security forces don't happen to be in that island of Area B, they can't go after the people the IDF wants them to go after until they get permission and everything is signed off, and that can take days. And it's not just about going after terrorists. There are huge swaths of Area B that have no police protection at all. They become havens for not only terrorism but drugs, arms depots, crime of all sorts. It's a security problem for Israeli settlers in the West Bank that have these festering areas of basically no man's land, sort of right next to settlements. It's obviously a problem in terms of terrorism that lands on the other side of the Green Line. It's very difficult to develop the economy in these areas in any robust way when there's no law and order. It's very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to enforce its sovereignty in the political way when there's no law and order. And so by rezoning 10% of Area C to Area B, and again, without moving one settler, one soldier, without dismantling one settlement, and not rezoning anything that is within 500 yards of an Israeli settlement or 500 yards of a security barrier, you can reduce these 170 islands of Area B down to, I think the number is 39, which will make a huge difference across the board in all three of these baskets: political, security, and economic. Finally, there is the regional component to this. Obviously, Israel has been trying to be better integrated into the Middle East for a long time, and it's impossible without any progress on the Palestinian front. Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump have both shown a lot of interest in this regional idea, but I think it's important to keep in mind that regional integration can't happen as a workaround to bypass the Palestinians. It can only happen as a parallel track to political progress with the Palestinians. That's a clear message that the pragmatic Arab states in the region have all given. They've said it to the president, they've said it to the prime minister. We at IPF have heard it ourselves. We were in Jordan a month ago, and we heard it repeatedly from the Jordanian government that everybody is truly interested and excited about engaging with Israel, but not as a workaround. And so the commanders for Israel security have advocated that the Israeli government accept the Arab Peace Initiative with reservations, but accepting it with reservations means that you can start to go down this path where you have deeper engagement with Israel's neighbors. And again, it should be pretty obvious that it helps in all three measures. For Israel security needs, being able to cooperate with Sunni Arab states in the region, share intelligence on Iran and other threats, even do joint military training exercises, it would be a big boost to Israeli security. From a political perspective, there's simply no way that Israel's international problems are going to go away, either at the United Nations or with BDS or even with difficult bilateral relationships, until Israel is better integrated in the region. And from a civil and economic perspective, the benefits to the Israeli economy of being able to really trade across borders, develop economic projects outside of Israel. You see this going on with Jordan now because of the peace treaty, but imagine if you can expand this to the Gulf states. how beneficial it would be to the Israeli economy and really to Israel's image around the world. And so these are three things that you'll find in this booklet. But as I said, there are a whole raft of others, and it's important to get these going now, because as I led with, there is no status quo. The status quo deteriorates every day, and the longer that these issues go unaddressed, the much more difficult it will be to address them in the long term and permanently. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ilan, who will talk about what security would look like in the event of a permanent status.
Well, thanks, Michael. So Michael talked about steps that should be taken today, but I think it's also important to try to look at sort of the long term. Is there a possibility where you can actually get to a two-state solution where Israel still remains secure? I worked as part of Secretary Kerry's team on the 2013 and 14 negotiations, and what we found very quickly in our engagement was basically that you will never get to a two-state solution unless you have a security system that meets Israeli requirements, but still allows Palestinians to have sovereignty and dignity. Now this has been long known, but there's been a sort of shift in evolution. You go talk to folks like Dennis Ross, who worked on the 2000 negotiations, and you'll hear that at that time security was the easy issue. Everybody assumed Jerusalem and refugees was a challenging one. The military folks and security experts on the Israeli and Palestinian side would just get together and work this out. It's all technical and not a problem. Things have changed. Why? More than anything, Gaza, the withdrawal from Gaza, the aftermath of what happened after that withdrawal, and the Gaza redeployment, really, I think, set the Israeli public back in terms of their confidence that any security arrangement could work. Add to that the Second Intifada, and also the withdrawal from Lebanon, southern Lebanon, what happened after there. So it's taken security from this sort of easier issue that could be worked out by experts to really maybe the most challenging threshold issue that if you can't get past it, you can't get to a two-state agreement. So this is the issue that we faced in 2013 and 14 when we were doing these negotiations, the last time serious negotiation happened on these questions. And so we put a lot of resources, and Secretary Kerry's team put a lot of resources working with General John Allen and the Pentagon to really try to develop the most robust solution ever developed to try to address these questions and meet Israeli requirements. And what we then did at CNAS was, after those negotiations collapsed, was we took a lot of the ideas that were there, we expanded on them, we engaged with Israelis and Palestinians, and developed this report that you can find at Two-State Security or on CNAS's website that goes into really all the details of what the security arrangements would look like that ultimately preserve that. And fundamentally, again, meet Israel's needs on security, meet Palestinian needs on sovereignty and dignity, somehow together. I should also say one other thing about the plan, right? The security plan assumes, this long-term security plan assumes that in any two-state agreement there'll be trade-offs. And importantly, the trade-off that most people agree, at least most people who've looked at this problem agree on, and also is in the Clinton parameters, the Kerry parameters, and all these other documents is, borders will have to lean towards Palestinians, and Israel will have to make concessions on territory in exchange for Palestinians making concessions on security. That's the fundamental trade-off. And so if you were to give the security plan to Palestinians and say, here's a starting point for a negotiation, they'd say, no thank you, not interested. But if you were to say, here's a security plan, and along with the security plan comes an agreement on the 1967 borders with swaps, basically equal size perhaps, then suddenly you're in the ballpark for a real negotiation that I think can get you to it. So one other thing before I get into the actual details of the plan, why do something like this now? Why even look at what the end state looks like, given how difficult the situation is right now, given that we have leadership on both sides that doesn't seem interested in negotiating a deal, and we have a government in Israel that clearly, at least the right-wing coalition, is not really interested in doing this. And we've sort of had a number of different reasons. First, and I think this is the most important, we still need to pierce this myth that it's impossible to ensure Israel's security in the context of an agreement. And so this is really meant to demonstrate that, great depth and analysis. Our report's, I think, like 75 pages of even, I think, smaller type than the commander's report. Second, as somebody who worked on these negotiations, I can tell you that one of the things we first did was really take all the work that had been done on the outside of the previous negotiations and use that as the basis for everything we did. So we thought it was just really important to preserve the ideas that were put together in the Ilan plan and make sure that future negotiators were armed with these ideas. And so that's the second thing. And third, it also, this type of work then informs everything Michael is discussing. In that if you really want to know what you can do today, you better know where you're going and make sure that these two things are integrated and consistent with each other. So a lot of the, in our report, even though the focus is on the end state and the two-state agreement and how we get there, on security, we do make a number of recommendations on, well, based on if you want to get there, then here are things you can do today, and a lot of those ideas are in the CIS work. And so, let me talk a little bit about the substance of the actual plan. At its core, what we try to do is look at the Gaza situation and say, how do we make sure that if Israel were to withdraw from the West Bank, that would not happen in the West Bank? And I think that what we developed were a layer of 7 different insurance policies to make sure that doesn't happen. And when Israel withdrew from the West Bank, it had from Gaza, it had one layer of insurance. That layer of insurance was, things go wrong, we can go back in. It's a very bad insurance policy. It turns out not to work. It turns out to be very expensive and completely politically infeasible and security-wise infeasible. So how do you make sure that doesn't happen? So, first thing, we talked about a multi-layered security system. So as opposed to one layer of security, we're talking about 5 layers of security. First layer of security is, this is part of an agreement. So Israel's relations with the Arab world in the aftermath of an agreement. You're talking about, really pushing out Israel's security perimeter to the edge of Jordan. You're talking about intelligence cooperation. You're talking with the Gulf states, with Jordan, with Egypt, and the types of relationships that you can have in the aftermath of the deal really expand Israel's security envelope and allow it to push out further. Second is border security, specifically on the border between Jordan and the future Palestinian state, around the Jordan River. So the big concern there, the big concern used to be, well, you'd have a huge Arab army, like conventional army, like Saddam Hussein's army, sending tanks across Jordan to Israel. That's much less of a concern today, especially since Israel's Air Force is capable of taking out any such force long before it ever gets to the border. And actually, all these tanks have to go through some very narrow passes in Jordan, where they basically get lined up one right after the other to get into the valley on the Jordanian side, and that's where you actually take all that out. But the big concern is, okay, what if this border becomes a smuggling ground for ISIS, for other groups? Jordan collapses. What do you do? And so we actually have a proposal in our plan. And again, sorry, I did not have there's this very it's this robust, I sort of joke we should give this to Donald Trump now to do this on the Mexican border. But you basically have, this plan that involves both on the Jordanian side and on the Palestinian side, much improved fencing and walls. You also have technology in terms of the ability to see 10 or 15 miles into Jordan. You have joint operating centers of Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Americans who can see this in advance, so you catch anything long before it even gets to the border. And then you also have a force that you sort of bring up and down the border. And over a period of time, that force transitions from an all-Israeli force to something else that we can talk about in a bit. But that's I think, then that second layer. The third layer then becomes internal Palestinian security forces, which, by the way, one of the best news stories of the last few years has been the effectiveness of Palestinian security forces and how much better they are than they used to be. And the close, you talk to any Israeli security official, and they'll tell you this has been the core change of what has happened and what has allowed Israel to defend itself much more effectively from terrorist threats in the West Bank. And Gadi Shamni, who's one of our co-writers, and also used to be the general in charge of Central Command. So he used to run the West Bank for Israel. Was there in 2007 after Gaza took over, after Hamas took over Gaza, and he likes to tell this story where the next day a new kind of Palestinians showed up to work on security. They were no longer interested in talking about Jerusalem and refugees and all kinds of other things. They wanted to talk about security because they realized the threat they face jointly against Hamas is a bigger threat than the threat they face from Israel. So there's a lot that you can do there to improve the Palestinian security forces beyond where they are now. Most importantly, building out something that would be we call a counterterrorism system, but would include essentially a SWAT team, similar to a SWAT team at the capacity of a large American city like LA or New York or Washington to deal with terrorist problems, even while keeping the Palestinian security forces demilitarized, i.e. incapable of threatening Israel. So this is the capacity that you need. Joint intel sharing, things like that. Fourth layer then becomes the border between Israel and Palestine. There you finish the wall or barriers Michael talked about. You also you can have special areas designated to secure certain things, like around Ben Gurion Airport, to make sure that there's no threat from rockets there. The counter-tunneling technology that the United States and Israel are already deeply engaged and working on together. And that's the fourth layer. And then beyond that is even the fifth layer, which is Israel still has the ability to defend itself by itself and take action if it must, if the Palestinians won't. That still exists, just the way we were able to go into Pakistan and take out Osama bin Laden, just the way Israel strikes into Syria every once in a while when it sees weapons moving across the border, Hezbollah, and things are problematic. If you do that every day, the entire agreement breaks down because the Palestinians will never accept it. The whole point of all the other layers I discussed was to ensure that that doesn't happen very often, but it still exists. The Prime Minister still has that option and will utilize it on occasion. And there'll even be times when the Palestinians sort of quietly want Israel to utilize it because they don't want to take the responsibility for doing something that's really politically difficult, and they can just blame the Israelis and everything can just go on. A couple of other key elements of the plan. One is, for all the security that Israel gets, it's really important that early on you have early steps that visibly change the situation for the Palestinians. That I think is really critical. So there's a lot of, for example, just reducing Israeli visibility in cities. You can move, for example, Israel doesn't need the entire Jordan River Valley. What Israel really needs is something right along the border. That's what the major concern is now. And so you can move, Israeli forces out of large areas of the Jordan River Valley, put them east of a highway where there still can be for like a long time, 10 or 15 years, but that, on a daily basis, Palestinians don't see them. That's what's the biggest problem for Palestinians: sovereignty and dignity. Early steps right on the border crossings. There's a difference between a crossing and then the actual, longer border, where you actually are putting Palestinians out in front on the crossing itself, so that when they go into their state, they see their own security people, even if you have Israelis quietly sitting behind windows, making sure that the situation is working, and Israel being reassured. A couple of other elements. Big one is, Israelis will insist that they have a veto over any final withdrawal from the West Bank. Palestinians will never accept the veto. How do you try to deal with that problem? And I always read this because it's just, and David's heard me probably read it 100 times. What we propose is a conditions-based, performance-dependent, area-by-area phase redeployment with target timetables. All right, it's a mouthful. What does it mean in English? This is what happens when military folks work on things like this. Although I'm not a military person, we had definitely elements of the team. What it means is, Israeli and Palestinian security officials, professionals, working together with Americans, or develop an incredibly detailed plan for the criteria that specifically need to be met for Israel to withdraw from different areas of the West Bank. Then you have a process by which you train and work to ensure that those criteria are met. So that's everything from the capacity of Palestinian security forces to building the infrastructure for different things like the border. That's step 2. Step 3 is then you have a separate, again, Israelis, Americans, Palestinians together, a group evaluate whether the criteria have actually been met, based on a timetable that the first evaluation happens on a timetable agreed to at the beginning of the process. If the criteria haven't met and everybody agrees the criteria haven't been met, great. Israel moves off of a specific area of the West Bank. If they haven't been met, you have a remediation process. You go back to the team that originally laid out the ideas. They then say, okay, here's what hasn't been met yet, the criteria that haven't met. You remediate, you go through the process, you come back again to another evaluation. Second time through, if Israelis if there's disagreement, and basically Americans and Palestinians are saying, we're good, it's time to redeploy, and Israel's saying no, then you start to punt it up to the political level because it's no longer a security question, it's a political question. The thing is, this will really help you sift through what's security versus what's politics. And I'll tell you, we've tried some of these things in the past with diplomats doing it, and as somebody who worked both at DoD and state, this is something DoD does a lot better. If you put a lot of security officials in the room together and really make it security oriented, they can come up with solutions. And that's the whole point of this. If you leave it to the politicians, then it's never going to happen and you get deadlocked. So this is an idea to really try to execute that. Finally, one final element, and this one is one that this one's probably the one that draws more fire than anything else, and is probably the most controversial. You need some kind of an external force, small external force, likely American, maybe NATO, whatever works for the parties, to do three things. One is monitor implementation. Two is do training. Those two, no controversy. Israelis are fine with that. Palestinians are fine with that. We already have foreign forces training Palestinians in the West Bank, not just Americans, but a whole bunch of other European countries. The third question is, are there some very specific operational things? For example, a force on the west, just on the Jordan River that eventually is not Israeli. That would be that would involve this external force. We recommend, there's a whole bunch of different options there. You can have Israelis and Palestinians can do it together. That didn't work so well in the 90s, to be honest with you. You can have the Israelis just do it if they can convince the Palestinians. I don't think you can convince the Palestinians, but hey, maybe you can get to it in a negotiation. I'm fine with that, whatever works for the parties. I think the best option is probably Americans, and our Israeli colleagues will say American Marines in particular. But that's just for some very limited operational things where Israelis don't have the trust in the Palestinians to do it. Palestinians don't have the trust in the Israelis to not overstep their bounds of doing it. So that's basically, I think, the key. I should say one final thing as we talked about that sort of target timetable and withdrawal. As we see it, it's probably like a 10 to 15 year process. That's not Bibi's 40 years. But it's also not the 3 to 5 years that used to be the case. I think in the Clinton parameters was 4 to 6 years. So something sort of in the middle that most security officials think, Israeli and American security officials think would work. So I'll stop there.
So I'll just recap in a few footnotes. We'll jump to questions. I think what we've presented here is, number one, what can you do to improve security in the absence of a negotiation process, and what can be on the table for future negotiations to work out the kind of mechanism over the long term. A few things that I have found really interesting in this process of the research that we've been doing over the last year plus, and some of the material that's in the book that we've passed out. The first is on the separation barrier. When you have a conversation now about building a wall to prevent illegals who might be committing acts of terror, it's a different context that people begin to think about specifically in this country related to immigration. I think it's important to note that the recommendations here try to accomplish two things. Number one, they try to ensure security while minimizing the harm to the daily lives of Palestinians. So first, as you'll note in the book, the route of the barrier is dramatically being altered in the proposals that we've been putting forward with our Israeli partners to ensure contiguity of Palestinian neighborhoods. The current route of the barrier, again, it's not yet built, but in the Gush Etzion, for example, bisects 6 Palestinian villages from Bethlehem, where they commute every day. It would be directly harming the impact of their daily lives to get to work every day. Would the fence be built there? And so the recommendation is to alter that route. But the other thing is to understand the context. Why is it so important that there be that barrier in Gush Etzion? Because Alon Shvut in the Gush Etzion block is where the 3 boys were kidnapped, leading to the sparking of the Gaza conflict. It's also the gap in the fence where the 2 terrorists from Hebron entered into Israel to shoot up the Tel Aviv restaurant last June. It is an actual security vulnerability that should be addressed. It should be addressed in a way that maximizes the potential for 2 states in the future, maximizes security, minimizes the harm on all communities involved. Second point, I think it's important to note about the rezoning. We talked very quickly sort of about the ABC dynamic. There's 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. 700,000 of those 2.5 million do not see police on the streets. And that's pretty much as basic as it gets. And that ultimately has security impacts. I think this is important to realize when you hear this idea that's being put forward by the far right today about annexing Area C, as if Area C is some sort of defined block that is separate from the Palestinian area. When in fact Area C has, as Michael said, 170 pots and holes in it. And we've heard about the concept of defensible borders for many years, right? Israel must have defensible borders. We often talk about the thin waistline of Israel, where it's about roughly 9 miles wide and one waistline. Well, imagine annexing Area C, but not A and B, with its 170 pockets. And as Michael said, in some cases, Area C is only the road. So that if you're on the road, you're in Area C. If you step off the road to the shop on the side, you're in Area B. So you're now changing your defensible border from potentially 9 miles to 9 meters. Okay, that's the concept. That's the difference that we're talking about. That's why it's so problematic. That's why this security issue must be addressed in this rezoning. The last thing I want to say is about the regional dynamic. The Arab Peace Initiative has been dormant for some time, but we should also recognize that one of the problems of the Arab Peace Initiative, one of the real obstacles, was the issue of the Golan Heights and the difficulty in Israel to negotiate a withdrawal from the Golan Heights, and the hard line, specifically of countries like Syria and Libya, who are no longer playing an active role in the Arab League, for reasons we now know why. Now is a good time to test the Arab willingness to revisit the Arab Peace Initiative, given that the Syrian part of this discussion, certainly for the moment, and it appears for the time being, is off the table. And one last point on the Jordanian option, or the Jordanian issue, I wanted to mention in relation to Ilan's discussion about how Israel's security border is not really the Jordan Valley, it's really Jordan's eastern border, and it's having a broad security relationship with Jordan. And I want to go back to this very, very, very problematic proposals of the far right to annex portions of the West Bank, or to take anything in the realm of annexation outside the context of negotiations. Even more, you've seen a rising number of Israeli politicians begin to talk about the solution to the Palestinian problem is Jordan, that Jordan is the Palestinian state. This is a concept that comes back every few years, okay? I just want to understand what they're saying. They're saying that one of 2 countries that has a peace agreement with Israel, that has an influx of roughly 1 million Syrian refugees on top of the 700,000 Iraqi refugees, with an economic crisis, the rise of terror incidents, with ISIS on its doorstep, and is as most important Arab partner with the United States in terms of intelligence and military efforts in the fight against ISIS. This idea that Jordan is Palestine is essentially calling for regime change in the heart of the Middle East with one of the few partners we have left. It is doing all of that and hoping for the best. That is a security nightmare, and it's a bad idea, and we should be calling it for what it is, which is a very, very bad and destructive idea. And so the idea now of engaging the region is, as Michael said, it's about 2 tracks, creating progress on the Palestinian track alongside progress on the Arab track, because the current alignment of interests should not be assumed to be everlasting. And now is the moment that should be seized. One last thing I'll mention, and then we can turn to questions, and that is, what are we doing as Americans about all this? I don't think any of this happens without the support and encouragement of the United States. Finishing the barrier will be controversial. There will be an uproar. It will be considered a land grab. The United States has to support such measures in the context of creating the 2-state reality on the ground and solidifying 2 states as the ultimate goal. And a lot of this is going to be a political heavy lift for Israelis. I think we've all heard recently about how Donald Trump may hurt or help. Michael's been writing a great deal about this, about how Netanyahu must now show his cards. Well, if you believe now that now is not the time to negotiate a deal, but you also are concerned about a binational future, you've got to take steps to ensure security and preserve the idea of 2 states for a better day. That's what we're trying to lay forward with our Israeli partners, and welcome your questions and engagement on these issues.
So I imagine there are some, so I'm going to just call people if they see them. Or the yellow jacket, mustard jacket, the woman with the scarf.
Oh, without raising my hand.
Oh, I thought you were. All right, your neighbor to the right. Sorry, I thought you did.
Elisa Elias. So I appreciate the emphasis on security and the approach that you're taking. And my question is in terms of the diplomatic option and sort of preserving that option. What, you mentioned that you spent a lot of time looking at what was done in the past and having a really deep grounding in that. What is your confidence, or do you see people in the current administration that have that sort of depth of knowledge and grounding? And if not, then what?
It's early. I mean, I sort of described in terms of this administration. I mean, they haven't really. Part of the problem. This is one of the things that honestly concerns me about the administration is, right now I sort of describe it as sort of like a brain that doesn't have any, arms and legs in the agency. There's no like connectivity through the nerve tissue. So you've got a whole bunch of people at the White House, but outside of the cabinet officials, you basically haven't appointed any of the key deputies and undersecretaries, envoys, things like that. And so we're going to have to wait and see. I mean, I think you hear Jared Kushner's name tossed around a lot. I don't know how much he's actually going to do, but there also is a learning process for these, for any new administration that comes in. So just because they don't really, I don't have a lot of confidence right now, but they'll learn the same lessons we all do over a period of time. And there is this consistent history of administrations coming in and sort of thinking they're reinventing the wheel. Even the Obama administration that I was part of, sort of came in on Israel-Palestine with the assumption the Bush administration had done nothing, even if the Bush administration in their last 2 years had done Annapolis, and sort of pushed all that aside. I just got an earful from a former Bush administration last week, just about that problem. So, right now, I mean, I don't think you have a situation where it's going to work with Israelis and Palestinians anyway until you get different leadership on both those sides. So I'm less worried about the American side on this issue than I am on the Israelis and Palestinians. Even on the regional question, you had these stories last week reported in Haaretz that Kerry had put forward an initiative, and it didn't work because Netanyahu's coalition, even if Netanyahu wanted to do something, and I think on the regional questions he might, his coalition wouldn't let him do it. I mean, he ultimately chose that coalition. He had a moment last year where we thought it might be Herzog coming in and Bennett leaving. Instead, we ended up with Lieberman in and Bennett still in. And so I don't take Netanyahu off the hook for that, but I do think you're going to need, whether it's a different configuration of the current Israeli government or elections over the next couple of years. But once you have that, I think you still have if you have a different leadership, I think the Trump administration has expressed every interest in trying to do something along these lines on the regional question.
Yes.
Bob Hornstein, Portland. During the JCPA mission, we met with Vice Admiral Ben Bashat. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the components he talked about was trying to financially incentivize those settlers that are outside the quote-unquote consensus blocks to relocate either inside those blocks or inside Israel proper. I'm just wondering, given the demographics, how realistic is that idea? And I'm just wondering, what percentage of that part of the settler population is really deeply ideological that would not in any way consider moving back into Israel proper or into the other settlements?
Yeah, so 80% of the people, of the settlers living east of the Green Line, live in 4% of the territory, what we would consider the blocks. So you're really talking about 20% of people who are outside. I don't think anybody can say definitively exactly how many of them are there for ideological reasons and a sort of hardcore hilltop versus those who are there for economic reasons. But I'd be willing to bet that the split is probably something like 75-25 at least in terms of economics versus ideology. And you have to remember the Israeli government for 5 decades, right, and starting with labor governments, provided enormous economic incentives for people to move to the West Bank. Many of them would leave if they were given compensation, and actually part of the Security First plan is to pass an absorption and compensation law where settlers voluntarily leave the West Bank and they will be resettled inside the 1949 armistice lines and pay compensation. And I think that the vast bulk of them will take it. That's still not to put on rose-colored glasses. That still leaves you with anywhere from
20,000.
I was gonna say somewhere between 30 and Ilan's even more optimistic than me. I was gonna say between 30 and 60,000 settlers. You know, depending on kind of how hardcore you're gonna be. Between 30 and 60,000 settlers who are probably there for real ideological reasons and are going to resist leaving. It doesn't mean that 30 to 60,000 of them are going to be violent when they are forced to leave. It doesn't mean that they won't eventually go. But it's going to be a difficult issue. I mean, nobody should kid themselves about that, right? You know, we're talking about something that's going to be very difficult. It's going to be a terribly searing experience for the IDF, for the Israeli government, for Israeli society, for the settlers themselves. This isn't something that should be celebrated. It's going to have to be done. It will have to be done. But this isn't a good thing. And I think that you know, as many as can be convinced to leave before they have to leave should. And I also think it's important and I've written this before, I think it's important that as part of any permanent status agreement, there is some provision made for settlers who want to stay and who agree to become residents of Palestine. And you know, that's a complicated issue. And but I think that for at the end of the day, if there are settlers who absolutely refuse to leave, there should be some accommodation made for them to give up their Israeli citizenship, or even I suppose accept dual citizenship, and live under the laws of Palestine. But getting as many out as possible before that is important.
Yeah, can I just hop in on that last point, because I think it's because you heard some arguments about is this ethnic cleansing of Israeli settlers, and I think it's important to remember that yes, that is the ideal situation where some of these people can stay. And there's just the practical realities that the people who are most likely to absolutely want to dig in and not stay and not leave are the ones who are going to be the most difficult in any situation like that. And then you start to run into questions of keeping them safe while moving the IDF off of areas, or keeping Palestinians safe from them in some cases too. And so, from an ideal perspective, I think you want that, but from a security perspective, this becomes really, really difficult to do. I don't think it's ethnic cleansing as much as just practical realities of this challenge.
Please.
In this world of accelerating technology, with Moore's law still in effect and still proceeding, how do you deal with the unknown unknowns? How do you satisfy someone who worries about the unknowns? Question mark.
This is the two-state, the final sort of two-state agreement. So I think that what the plan also includes is a couple of things. One is, a lot of joint cooperation centers, areas where Israelis and Palestinians continue to work on security together. For example, Israel keeps an eye on all the borders. You can have, in some cases, you'd have, rather than having IDF, you have Mossad, or you have Shin Bet, you have people like that who are plainclothes, who are sitting there working, keeping eyes on the ground inside the West Bank. And it's also it's a long process. We're talking about 10 to 15 years, and even after that 10 to 15 years, you still have these cooperative mechanisms in place all over the West Bank and elsewhere, specifically to adapt, and that mechanism still exists. We talked about it as this mechanism for, setting security requirements together, meeting those requirements. If the requirements aren't met, then you have a remediation process. You have this board of security, Israeli, American, Palestinian security officials who are doing this together. The person who has the board is an American 3-star general who already is in Israel. We have an American 3-star general who's responsible for training the Palestinian security forces, which, by the way, it's an American 3-star general commanding 50 people. Usually American 3-star generals are commanding like 20,000 people. So this shows you how much of a commitment there is to this issue by the United States, and also how politically difficult it is. So all that stays in place specifically to adapt and deal with new changes. The best response to Moore's law is human adaptability, and so I think the whole point of this mechanism keeps that in place.
To add on, because I was also at that session, our mission in Israel. How effective is the CIS, which has sort of sold me on their idea, but how effectively are they selling their approach within the Israeli public and the Israeli leadership?
So it remains to be seen. They had a major campaign in January that lasted 10 days that was
incredibly provocative, controversial, to the extreme. One morning, Israelis woke up and everywhere on billboards, video boards throughout the country were sign images of a Palestinian flag and really a mob of Palestinians cheering with an Arabic sign that you had to dial a number to understand what it said in Arabic. And when you called the number, it said, had a gentleman say, soon will be the majority. And an Israeli general got on the line and said, do these ads disturb you? They disturb me. But you have to understand that in a few days, these ads are going to go away. What won't go away are the 2.5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank. What we don't need is, we don't need annexation, we need separation. And that was the message. So all over Israel, what it said in Arabic was, soon will be the majority. And after a couple of days, the billboards switched to separation, not annexation, keep Israel Jewish and secure. Now from the right, Naftali Bennett on Facebook immediately attacked the group, giving them much more coverage, calling them, don't listen to the leftist generals who brought us the Gaza disengagement, criticizing them from the left. And now from the left decried the campaign as racist because it played on fears of Arabs. And frankly, it did have elements, let's be honest. What it did was it cut right to the heart, to the gut, as the generals say. They did a survey before they launched this campaign on what are the issues that really matter to Israelis when they talk about the issue of the Palestinians and the long-term concern of a two-state solution. And we always talk, including at IPF, our mission is Jewish, democratic, and secure. Well, in CIS's polling, for the group that they want to target, okay, which is the soft right Jewish voter that needs to vote for a more centrist or center-left party in order to change the nature of the government. Those people are going to respond to a campaign that speaks to the future of the Jewish nature of the state and of security. And they're less concerned about democracy. And so that's really what the campaign was aiming, was to show that without separation, responsible separation from the Palestinians, and against the dangerous annexation plans, Israel's Jewish nature is going to be under threat, and its security will be under threat. The last thing I'll say about this is that it was incredibly timely because it happened on the exact same day that Naftali Bennett put forward a bill to annex Ma'ale Adumim, which is very problematic. We can describe why in detail, but it was important because the nature of the conversation switched, as I think Susie mentioned in the opening, from two states, no two states negotiations or not. Now the question is, are you for annexation or are you for separation? And this is increasingly the dialogue in Israel. Yair Lapid over the weekend was on a Face the Nation type show, and he was using the language of separation. But it's really now, these are the two camps at a time when we're not in a negotiating process. So the question is, it remains to be seen if this CIS campaign can sustain itself, but they went from an unknown quantity, and within a week, they were everywhere. Because they did it in such a provocative, in-your-face sort of way.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I apologize.
Okay,
Sorry.
this woman and then my cantor.
So your plan makes so much intellectual sense, like I'm thinking, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know, if you're actually standing there, if it's quite as clear. I'm very curious to know though, if, is there any buy-in on the part of Palestinians?
Yes.
I can talk about it first, and you can talk about it after. So with security first, it's a plan developed by 265 Israeli generals. They did not, for obvious reasons, want to have any public Palestinian component or even public Palestinian buy-in. But when they were developing this plan, they were in contact with extremely high-ranking officials inside the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and General Reshef, chairman of the group, will tell you that when this ad campaign launched on a Sunday in January, He got a call that afternoon from a high-ranking PA official, who said, "Great job, keep it up. This is great for you guys and will be great for us." I think you have to remember that the Palestinian Authority, is going to be in favor of anything that starts to create this separation, right? They're under pressure as well from their own, I'll say the right, but Hamas is obviously describing as right wing is not the accurate description, but they're under pressure as well from far more extremist groups, and anything that sort of improves their sovereignty within the areas they control, which this absolutely does, gives them sort of a political victory, which this absolutely does, improves the economy, which this absolutely does, is something that they're not going to come out and publicly say, hey, we're in favor of independent Israeli moves that are not coordinated with the PA, but yes, this is something that is good for them, and they realize that and they communicate it.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties of the CIS plan is it doesn't require anything from the Palestinians. Though Israel can probably get a lot internationally out of this and can probably, if it wanted to, can probably ask the United States for, if we're going to do this, can you help us with X, Y, or Z? And I'm sure you have American administrations willing to work with Israel to incentivize them to do that. On the two-state plan, same thing. The plan ultimately had 4 co-authors, 2 American, 2 Israeli. Two sort of American security official and myself on the political side, and then an Israeli security official, Gadi Shamni, General Gadi Shamni, and Nimrod Novik, who's on the political side. But we also spent a lot of time talking to Palestinian security officials. We spent a lot of time in Jordan talking to Jordanians as well about their concerns on the Jordan River, for retired Jordanian security officials. You don't want their names on the report ultimately because for them, anything on security is a concession by the Palestinians. So Palestinians are not going to want to put their name on that report unless it also includes borders. And again, the real audience is trying to show this to Israelis, to the American Jewish community, to everybody that this is something that's possible for those who are most sensitive about this question. But yeah, if you were, like I think I said earlier, if you put this security plan in front of Palestinians and you said this is it, they'd say, no thank you. But if you put it in front of them and said, here's a security plan in the context of an agreement on borders that's 1967 with swaps for the major blocks, I think that you're very much in the ballpark of a negotiation.
Okay. A question. You speak a lot, most of the plan is based on borders and the walls, security agreements. What makes the Palestinian state viable? How does it survive? And if it's a weak state, how is that a secure and security for Israel?
So you're talking about sort of
Economic
one set.
what's the economic view
Right.
as opposed to the war? Let's say?
Right. Are you asking in the context of
Yes,
the near-term measures?
Yes.
Right. So the barrier, completing the barrier is obviously one component, but there is a whole basket of civil and economic measures. So part of the rezoning that I talked about, was helpful to improving the Palestinian economy. I also mentioned increasing worker permits into Israel, which of course benefits the Palestinian economy. On Jerusalem separately, I didn't talk about Jerusalem, although it's the most difficult issue, but also kind of my favorite issue. Jerusalem is a whole nother kettle of fish. I mean, I think one of the most revealing statistics that I've seen on anything having to do with Israelis and Palestinians is that in all the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, there's not one municipal playground, not one. This plan includes a whole development component for East Jerusalem. It creates a municipal umbrella authority that will give the Palestinians in East Jerusalem control over their own planning, zoning, permitting, construction, to really develop the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem that have been criminally neglected by the Israeli government and the Jerusalem municipality. There's also a whole section in here, and again, go to the website, you can see it in depth. There's a whole section here on Gaza, economic measures for Gaza, including increasing the capacity of the power station, building a desalination plant, starting down the road of figuring out if a port can be built and how the security would work if there was a Palestinian port in Gaza. So there's a whole raft of economic measures in here. I have focused on the security aspects today, but there's a whole raft of economic measures as well.
Oh, the Palestinian point of view,
Mhm.
are they on their own, or are they looking for assistance constantly?
In terms of economics.
Yes.
So, I think that one of the things that everyone has to realize is that the Israeli and Palestinian economies are now intertwined and are going to be intertwined, in a way that, the same way that our economy here is intertwined with Canada's or with Mexico's, as long as NAFTA is still around. It's incredibly intertwined. It's a small space. You have Palestinians working in Israel. You will likely have Israelis working in the state of Palestine. The economies are going to be dependent on each other, and so. So to talk about the Palestinian economy independently, I think is impossible. But to the extent that we're talking about continuing billions of dollars of international aid to the Palestinian Authority every year, I think that the idea is for that to cease, and particularly once you actually have two states and you were able to negotiate real trade agreements and economic agreements, not only between Israel and Palestinians, but between the Palestinians and other states, which right now they cannot do. I think you're talking about a much more robust and viable economy, because many of the building blocks are there. They're just very difficult to implement with the current situation.
So the issue of trust is based on growth in those economies. That's just as much as
Mhm.
wall.
Yes, I agree, 100%.
Absolutely, and I just want to throw in a couple additional points here. When we were doing these negotiations in 2013 and 14, if you remember, Secretary Kerry had a $4 billion economic plan for the Palestinians and talked about it in great detail. The first step of that plan to unlock the Palestinian economy were steps Israel needed to take to sort of take various limitations off. Israel controls all the borders going in and out of that state, controls the flow of trade, controls all kinds of things. And so, if you want to get away from a position where the Palestinians are just dependent on economic aid, you have to take these things. You have to allow for much more free flow of commerce and stuff like that. And Area C, we talked about 4 or 10% here. At state we had a 1% plan. Just give the Palestinians 1% for economic development of Area C, 1% to the West Bank, and you're talking about the right 1% could be billions of dollars for them potentially. So I think that's also critical. And one other point it's come up a couple of times here in terms of internal Palestinian security and the lack of access to Palestinian police to their own territories. You have all these areas. I don't think anybody really explained why this happens. You have these areas like Area B and C where you have Palestinians living. Israeli security forces and the IDF are in charge of the security, but they don't want to do local policing of Palestinians, and Palestinians don't want to be policed by them. But they also don't let Palestinian police come into those areas, even though Palestinian police wants to come into those areas, and people want them there. It's just so you end up with all these areas where you just have crime and just lack of, these types of things, basic security that you just need for day-to-day lives. We talk a lot about Israeli security. Palestinians want security too. They want to be able to walk down the street without being mugged and without just basic things like that for their kids. So I think that's part of the whole component here, East Jerusalem being the best example, where there's just no police in East Jerusalem. There's no Israeli police and no Palestinian police. You need to have some kind of a deal there.
Yeah, one very quick anecdote that
Sorry.
I'm good at anecdote this when he wants to ask me afterwards.
I see we have more questions, but we are running out of time, I'm afraid. So let me just offer some concluding thoughts, and then you're welcome to come up and ask your questions, of course. Because I've been involved in the Jewish community for a long time as a lay person, and many people here, that's what we do, either as a professional or as a volunteer. We're all working in this space. So I just kind of want to not summarize, but offer some thoughts in conclusion, and also talk a little bit about IPF serving as a resource to you in your community. First, I mentioned the 50th anniversary of the occupation. I think we're already anticipating that there's going to be a lot of activity on the BDS front, especially as we get closer to the actual anniversary of the 6-Day War. So what you've heard today is really counter to the idea of Israel remaining a permanent occupier, and I think it's very this information and these proposals are very potent in our continual engagement in the fight against BDS. Second, we're providing pragmatic answers to the eternal claim that there is no partner, or using Palestinian rejectionism, which there certainly has been an abundance of over the years, but using that as an excuse for inaction. Because the fact is, Israel cannot afford to use that as the excuse for inaction, and that's why we're talking about what the commanders put forward, pragmatic, immediate steps that Israel can take without a partner, but that will help to improve the situation. I also would offer that I think that we need to think a lot about the term pro-Israel and what that means. I feel like it's been politically hijacked, and we really need to, as a Jewish community, we all consider ourselves pro-Israel. It means different things to different people, but I think what's great about what you're hearing here and what we're supporting is the emphasis on security is parv and not political. I mean, everything in Israel and the West and the Middle East is political, but it really is a parv idea that whether you're from the left end of the political spectrum or the right or somewhere in between, I think we can all agree that preserving Israel's security, improving Israel's security, is paramount as a way forward. And clearly, we at IPF we're taking our case across the Jewish community, and that's the other thing I just wanted to mention. We're happy to serve as a resource to you in your community. We've already had conversations with JCPA about doing webinars. We get to communities around the country on a regular basis. We convene communal roundtables. If you have an interest in our coming to visit you, please let us know. Finally, if you're not on our email list, please do sign up. You will get Michael Koplow's weekly Koplow column on Thursdays. You'll get IPF's weekly digest on Fridays. You'll get access to our conference calls. We actually have one this Thursday with Bougie Herzog at 1:30. So you can sign up for that. And we also, of course, have public events from time to time in various communities. And finally, a couple of you mentioned missions, and we are happy to serve as a resource to you in Israel when you plan your next communal mission, because we can put you directly in touch with some of the Israeli security experts. I can tell you personally, there is no substitute for seeing with your own eyes and hearing with your own ears and having it explained to you exactly how this would work and what the implications are. You know, standing on the outskirts of Ma'ale Adumim and being told the annexation plan is not just about annexing Ma'ale Adumim proper, but 6 times the land around it, which prevents the eventual development of eastward of an eventual capital of East Jerusalem. So these are resources that we are at IPF are happy to provide. And I really want to thank you. You've been a great audience, very attentive with great questions, and we're happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.